Welcome to All Things Economics. I'm Gil Mathew, Executive Director of the Economic Resource Council of Nevada County and your host. Today we're going to take a look at the state of sentiment, where we dig into how people feel about the economy. Today we're going to dive into consumer sentiment in California using data from Stanford's California Economic Survey and compare it to the U.S. broadly using the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index and related national measures. We'll explore where Californians are more or less optimistic or pessimistic and what's driving that, and what the implications might be. Before we get into the numbers, a quick refresher. Consumer sentiment is a somewhat squishy but powerful gauge of how households perceive current economic conditions and expect things to evolve. It often captures views on jobs, inflation, personal finance, major purchases, and uncertainty. While it doesn't perfectly predict economic outcome, sharp shifts in sentiment can precede changes in spending, investment, and policy. In the national context, one of the most widely watched benchmarks is the University of Michigan Survey of Consumers, which releases a monthly consumer sentiment index. At California state level, Stanford's Institute for Economic Policy Research has launched a California Economic Survey conducted quarterly via YouGov, with questions structured to parallel those national surveys, so California results are more comparable. So, with that background, let's dig into what these surveys say today. Let's start with California. In December of 2024, the Stanford YouGov Consumer Economic Survey measured consumer sentiment in California with a score of 80.3. Over the same period, the University of Michigan index score for the United States was 74.0. By March of 2025, sentiment in California had plunged to 68.6, a drop of 11.7 points, while nationally, Michigan's survey fell about 16.1 points over the same stretch to 57.9. The decline in California is thus broadly aligned with the broader U.S. trends, but the starting point and the relative severity offer some interesting questions. A few state-level particulars. In California, inflation, housing costs are top worries. Environmental concerns have also climbed. Climate change and environment was the third most pressing issue. On trade and tariff sentiment, 73.6% of Californians expected tariffs to hurt the average American. Interesting, within California, Los Angeles County's sentiment was somewhat more resilient, 8.6 higher than the rest of the state, and declined less sharply over the quarter. In short, California started the period somewhat more optimistic than the U.S. average, but have experienced a sharp pullback. Their concerns reflect both national pressures of inflation, tariffs, and state-specific stresses, housing, climate, insurance, etc. Now let's shift to the U.S. as a whole. As of August 2025, the U.S. University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index had declined to 58.6 from 61.7 in July. More recently, in September 2025, preliminary data showed a further slide to 55.4, down from 58.2. Drivers behind the national slide: inflation continues to bite consumers, seeing rising prices which erode purchasing power and dampen optimism. Labor market worries, concerns about job security and employment prospects has increased. Trade, tariffs, supply chain disruptions add uncertainty. Thus, the national trend is one of declining confidence, raising caution, and an economy where many consumers feel on edge. Let's now directly compare and highlight differences and similarities between California and the national trends. Starting optimism and decline. California began the period, December 2024, more optimistic than the U.S. average, 80.3 versus 74.0. But the drop in California, 15%, over the next quarter is steep and tracks the national decline of 16.1 points. This suggests that while California had a buffer of optimism, many of the same macro headwinds hit the state hard. Issue priorities differ somewhat. Nationally, inflation, jobs, and trade dominate consumer concerns. In California, housing costs, climate, environment, and insurance, especially in fire-prone areas, are more salient. Also, tariff sentiment is especially strong in California. With so many large ports as entry point and exit points for trade, California feels more strongly about tariffs than most of the rest of the nation. Within California, Los Angeles County held up better than other parts of the state in that quarter. California's diverse economy, tech, agriculture, entertainment, services, means shocks hit unevenly. In some sectors, confidence may be more fragile. That is, in lower income, housing stressed communities. Nationally, sentiments tend to smooth over regional variations, but recessions or downturns often hit some states harder than others. Lag in forward-looking signals. Because California's survey is quarterly, there may be a lag in capturing sharper month-to-month savings seen in national surveys. The National Michigan Index is monthly, so it's more responsive to shorter shocks, i.e. inflation, news, CPI releases, Fed announcements. Therefore, one might expect the next California survey to pick up the continued sentiment erosion seen nationally. Possible divergence ahead if macro policies or fiscal relief is regionally targeted. California might recover sentiment faster or slower than the national average, depending on how the state policies, housing markets, and energy climate costs evolve. Also, California's exposure to climate risk, insurance markets, wildfire adds an extra layer of uncertainty that most states do not share to the same degree. What does all this mean for businesses, policymakers, and listeners? Consumer spending, volatility. If sentiment remains weak, households may cut back on discretionary spending, especially big-ticket items, autos, appliances, vacations. That could slow growth, especially in sectors sensitive to consumer purchases. Policy response. Federal and state policymakers may consider stimulus, tax relief, or regulatory measures to shore up confidence. For California, housing relief, insurance reform, climate adoption, spending could be leverages. Monetary policy feedback loop. The Fed watches consumer confidence as part of its inflation-unemployment trade-off. If sentiment stays down, it may increase pressure for rate cuts on devilish signals. National sentiment drops in September, for example, may strengthen arguments for easing state inequality and sector divergence. In California, the gap between coastal, high-income, and tech-driven areas versus inland and more rural, low-income areas may widen. Sentiment might recover faster in booming metropolitan corridors than in regions facing decline. Watch upcoming data releases. The next California Economic Survey will be critical for seeing whether sentiment continues a downward or stabilizes. On the national side, subsequent Michigan indexes, consumer board updates, and consumer spending numbers will show whether pessimism translates to pullbacks. To wrap up, consumer sentiment in California has mirrored much of the national slide seen since late 2024, but with a distinct flavor: elevated concerns about housing, climate, insurance, and tariffs. California started with more optimism than the U.S. average, but it also has had a further fall. Going forward, whether California's bounce back faster, slower, or differently than the national average will offer insight not only into the Golden State's economic resilience, but into how regional differentiated economies recover may unfold. All of this said, the confidence level is a lot lower than we would like, but spending has continued at a record pace. So we will have to watch and wonder until the next time. This is Gil Mathew, the Economic Resource Council of Nevada County, and this is All Things Economic. Until then, be well and thrive.